Hello everyone, my name is Claire Robbins and I am a senior politics major from Holden, Massachusetts. I'd like to be the first to welcome you to this exciting event featuring top journalists hosted by the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and St. Anselm College. The New Hampshire Institute of Politics first opened in 2001 and has since then continued the mission of being a nonpartisan forum for discussion and debate on all aspects of the American political process. Please feel free to tweet and use social media throughout the event, but we do ask that you silence your electronic devices. At the end, there will be a brief question and answer period. If you would like to ask a question, please approach one of the microphones on either side of the room. We will try our best to answer as many questions as possible, but due to everyone's schedules, we do have to cut the question and answer period after a certain amount of time. I would like to now introduce the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, Neil Levesque. In addition to serving as the executive director here, Neil is also the chief of staff of the college and a resource and mentor for all of his students. Please welcome Neil.
Well, welcome back everyone to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. I see a lot of very friendly faces. Many people have been here before. This is a great panel. We're very, very happy that many of you flew in to this afternoon or going back to Washington tonight. So this is a very tiresome day for some of you, so we appreciate you doing what you're doing. We could not, though, do this program without our very special friend, Dan Balz. He has been just so helpful to this institute and to the Harvard Institute of Politics, too, in Boston. Together with our partnership with them, he's never shies away from coming up, working with us, working with our students. And so, Dan, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much. It's delightful to be back here. Particularly with this distinguished group of journalists, we're going to have a really interesting and lively discussion tonight. All of us have enjoyed spending time in this state. We appreciate the first in the nation tradition, which still seems to persist despite all efforts to get rid of it. I suspect this is a time of relative solitude. In a matter of perhaps months, days, hours, you'll be overrun with candidates for 2020. I hope you're enjoying the quiet time now. Maybe you're getting restless and are looking for more action up here, but be careful what you wish for. We're in for a lively 3 years, this year and the next 2. Also, I think all of us appreciate the balmy weather you've given us. We're not used to 60 or 65 degree weather in February. We're used to what you had over the weekend as opposed to this. So thank you in many ways. We are in a very unusual time, more unusual, I think, than most of us who are on this panel, and probably those of you in the audience can remember. Country deeply divided along partisan lines, a president who operates outside the norms of what we've been used to in past presidents, and news media facing a lot more criticism probably than any of us have remembered in recent times. As president, Donald Trump has called the press the enemy of the people. His former chief strategist said we are the opposition party. The president has said at one point he is frankly disgusted that the press can write whatever it wants. He has said that libel laws are a shame and a disgrace. He has said it's time perhaps to think about challenging the broadcast licenses of television networks. And of course he has made the term fake news part of the modern lexicon of American politics. Along the way, the credibility of our business has been called into question, and the divisions that existed long before President Trump was elected have, if anything, widened and deepened. So we're going to try to talk about all of that tonight with these 4 great journalists. They each have unique perspective on it from their different perches and their different platforms. Let me introduce them as we go down the line. Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent at Slate and a political analyst at CBS News. Shannon Pettypiece is the White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. Domenico Montanaro is the lead editor for politics and digital audience at NPR. And Hallie Jackson is the chief White House correspondent for NBC News. So away we go. Jamelle, let me start with you. You recently wrote the following: American democracy looks more fragile than it has at any time since Trump was elected. So what I wanted to do is start off by saying, do you include the institution of the press in that assessment? What's different about what we're going through today? And is the Trump era an abnormality or the beginning of a new normal?
So I do include the press in that sort of summation of, I think, where the country is right now. A free, open democracy depends on a free and open press, and it depends on the press having at least some legitimacy with the public at large. People need to believe that the press is at least acting in good faith, is attempting to get to the truth of the matter. And when they don't, when sort of the press just becomes another disputed actor in the scrum, it's difficult to begin to establish a kind of common language and common facts for which we can actually do democracy. And the extent to which, before President Trump, the extent to which the press has become steadily less legitimate to larger numbers of Americans, I think does endanger sort of how we do democracy in this country. That's been, again, an ongoing trend. I think the president has sort of accelerated it, made it worse, weaponized that distrust. But it's here, and if I knew what to do about it, then I would, not have student loans to pay off anymore. What was in your
so the question is this an abnormal moment,
right,
or the beginning of a new normal in where we are?
That's something I go back and forth on, because you could make a case that the fragmentation in the press, the ideological nature of some elements of the press, the partisanship of some elements of the press, your Breitbarts, your Daily Callers, so on and so forth, has a precedent in the sort of past 100 years ago, right? Like in the 1910s, 1920s, there was no sort of major objective news source. There were newspapers and there were publications, there were pamphlets, and everyone was sort of vying for influence in this like intensely contested market. So you can make that case. I think the difference is that that was a period where there were also other strong mediating institutions that people engaged in. So more Americans went to church, more Americans were members of unions, more Americans were members of other sorts of civic organizations that themselves acted as conduits for information that people trusted. And those organizations, those institutions have definitely declined in modern day America. And so in the absence of these major mediating institutions and with the fragmented press, I do think that we're in this sort of new era, and no one's quite sure what to make of it. Everyone's struggling to figure out how you do democracy in an intensely pluralistic country where increasingly fewer people agree on what constitutes sort of like the common polity and the common politics.
Fair enough. Hallie, no modern president has had what I would call a great relationship with the White House press corps and with the press in general. But how would you describe the relationship between this White House and the people who cover it daily?
Adversarial. And I think that's obvious to, as you just listed, excuse me, like a number of things that the president and his staff have said about the news media. Now, I will say Sarah Sanders briefs in front of the camera on a fairly regular basis, which is a good thing. There's been a lot of discussion on whether that's helpful. Is it helpful to go to these briefings? Is it helpful for the White House to have these briefings when you're getting what a lot of people view as either not enough information or the wrong information, misinformation from the White House? I personally fall on the side of, I think it's helpful to get somebody on the record to say something about a thing, because that's critical. You look at what happened I think this past couple weeks has been a good example. The Rob Porter case, the former staff secretary facing allegations of domestic abuse. The on-the-record statements from one day to the next contradicted each other. And it's difficult. There's obviously a lot of background reporting that happens as well, but I think it's important to get these folks to be accountable for something in front of the camera in what sometimes I call them clip and save moments. It may not be useful for you today, in whatever story you're working on today, but it will be useful down the road. I do think that some of the antagonism that you see from this White House is performative. It is a little bit playing to an audience. When you shut the door and go back in the West Wing and have conversations, there is often a different tone. And I would say on both sides. And I don't always think that's a good thing. I think that if you're in the briefing, you should act like you do when you're sitting in somebody's office and not perform for cameras, no matter which side of the podium that you're on. But I do think that this is a president who, on the one hand, uses the news media, and on the other hand, abuses the news media. And that is as you say, Dan, no president likes getting tough questions from people. Nobody enjoys that. I don't think President Obama enjoyed that, or President Bush or President Clinton. But that's the job that we're here to do. I think that other presidents have faced the press more, and I do think that's critical. We just hit it's weird to call it an anniversary, but an anniversary of the last formal news conference, solo news conference from Donald Trump. Now he does, which is the least of any president in modern history. He does answer questions in a lot of other ways. The South Lawn departures, when he flies off and goes to a trip, you're obviously out there yelling questions. He does press conferences with foreign leaders and takes a limited number of questions, but it's different than standing up there and having to face questions from members of the media in a setting where you can actually hear, where the helicopter rotor isn't going and there's not 600 people yelling and the Secret Service people going, all right, let's, whatever. So it would be helpful to be able to have that kind of setting. I'm not sure how that's going to play out over the next 3 years. Clearly, it's not going to change. It was there on the campaign. It's there now. It's personal. In some cases, for the president, it's vindictive. At the same time, he'll sit down with somebody at Mar-a-Lago and talk for 40 minutes.
In TV and radio, that's called bad tape. When you're out there with the helicopters going and you can't make out like a soundbite. And don't think that's not intentional either. He knows the producer aspect of television, and he kind of likes messing with us. So then he'll do that just as another little way to kind of...
He kind of, enjoys us being like a pack of animals.
Having
to be like a pack of animals. I'm not sure if this is on, but there is a sense of, but like I agree with everything you say, but the way that we can, like people, and I've only covered this administration, but other people have told me that, when they went into the Oval Office and asked a question of Obama or Bush,
he never answered. He had incredible discipline in that way.
And here, there's Bloomberg, and we're in the pool, so we're in there all the time. There's so many questions I've asked. I've gotten to personally ask the president. The answer might be, we'll see, but that to even have that opportunity, and they'll come out of nowhere. Like I said, like that time at Bedminster when the reporters were there, and he did this 40-minute Q&A, and basically people ran out of questions, and he took questions to the end. Or he'll come back on the plane sometimes, and a lot of times it's off the record, sometimes it's on the record. So it's this weird accessibility to him also that we have. That it's just it's like everything about him. It's unorthodox. It's not like any other president, but we do get a lot of contact with him.
And it is a double-edged sword. I think it's always great to have access and more access. And I think you're right. I'm in your boat too. I never covered any former president. I came in on the campaign covering Republicans. I've only covered Republicans and Donald Trump in my sort of political career here at NBC. But he does. You walk into one of these meetings, you'll yell questions, and sometimes he'll take them. He does get to choose what questions he wants to answer.
And that goes for his Twitter feed too, because if you think about, it's as potentially reckless as it is, and when you have U.S. officials going to the Munich Security Conference and saying, don't pay attention to the tweets, that's probably not what you want to do. We are getting an unfiltered, unvarnished look at what a president actually thinks. For all of what it is that you may think of what he thinks, you're seeing in ways that you wouldn't actually see from any other president, because they would so carefully craft it. To your point about the adversarial nature, it reminded me, I heard Ted Koppel once say that he's proud to have been in the adversarial camp of every president he's covered. I'm not sure that we need to be antagonists, right? But we need to be, we need to hold the line for truth. That's the key. And we need to, I've never seen a story that has had to have 17 sources from your newspaper, but I remember All the President's Men, they're running around looking for a second.
Right.
I'm going to get back to that in a minute. I'm sure that all of you have gotten emails or tweets from other people saying, why do you pay so much attention to the tweets? How do you evaluate that? We've now gone through a long period where we're used to this coming at us. But how do you know when to really respond as opposed to what U.S. officials said in Munich over the weekend, don't pay attention to the president's tweets. We have to pay attention, and yet how do we evaluate? What's the measure of how you think about when he starts tweeting what you do?
I've done a lot of thinking about this. There's a couple things. First of all, the tweets are like news conferences or a press statement, right? I mean, he goes out there and says it. It's something that a president has said. Now, we don't report on every press release that we receive, right? So we have to use our news judgment to say, is this newsworthy, is it not? And we have to give the proper context and fact-checking around it. We fail if we're not doing that. At NPR, what we tried to do, because I didn't want us all led around by the tweets like it was a set of keys, you know, for the dog to go chasing after, we created a page that was just all the tweets that we thought were newsworthy, and then I had a reporter who would annotate those tweets. And you know, before we created it, we had this conversation like, are we going to go through all this time and effort and work to create this thing? What if he never tweets again?
Yeah, we had I remember at the beginning, it was like, are the tweets what he really feels and thinks, or are they just things he's saying to be, I don't know, provocative or distractive? And I remember talking to my colleagues overseas who, they were basically saying, oh no, the tweets aren't, they're just for a domestic audience. That's not really how they feel. And then having a conversation with some colleagues, I forget when it was, maybe in October, where the sense in Europe was, no, the tweets are how the president feels. Like, I think at this point we have enough sense that the tweets are not, he stands by those tweets. He seems to stand by what he says in the tweets. And when he tweets something, and then when we talk to White House officials about what was in the tweet, it seems to be, no, he really feels that way about kneeling in the NFL. He's not just, or that's where he's coming down on this issue.
What's his audience for the tweets?
Everybody, 47 million people, the entire country, the entire world. These are the president's words. And so I understand that not every president's word has the same kind of weight. As Domenico says, different press releases get covered in different ways when they come from the White House. But they are what the president has to say. But
do you see it as performance, or do you see it as a statement of policy?
I see it as a statement. I see it as a statement of policy. I see it as, I use a visualization. If President Bush popped open the door to the Oval and yelled a tweet, like, and said it in those words, but it was actually a president saying them in person, would we cover it? So if some president opens the door and goes, we had a really great day with these fun people who came to the White House to talk about X policy. That is sort of one of those tweets that is a little more anodyne. It's something that you might see in a typical president, in a typical administration, quote unquote, you know, traditional. If somebody opens the door and says, you know, I don't know about this porn star who I'm alleged to pay all this money to, or whatever the tweet is, you know, would you cover it if it was any other president? Yes, of course you would, because it's the president's words. And that's how and I get that shiny objects, you don't want to be distracted, and I think it's important to parse out what's critical and what's not, but he's not performing. This is what he feels. This is what he's saying.
I think he's always performing, though.
Fair.
I mean,
Fair.
right? I mean, I think that it may be what he feels. I'm not sure he knows exactly what he wants ideologically. I mean, I've been thinking about this with the gun debate. You know, back in 2000, he wrote in his book that when he, you know, it's a chapter says guns, and he goes through it and he takes on the NRA and says, you know, the Republicans are too hardline on the NRA. I support an assault weapons ban, don't generally support gun control, and I support stricter background checks. Well, getting through a Republican primary with that message isn't necessarily something that can be done, and he flip-flopped on it. But I think he's performative in the sense that, like, he thinks he's the producer and he's created this reality, and you know, he wants to, you know, he's very cognizant of the optics of everything, not so much, I mean, he doesn't have the same level of self-control that most presidents do to kind of keep it within scaffolding, and that can take us all in all kinds of directions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's strange about the president and his tweets is that, in general, in the past, presidential rhetoric had weight, not just because it was newsworthy, but because presidents themselves spoke carefully, right? They used the words with discretion. And so the act of using your words with discretion helps create some scarcity around them. It gives value to those words in addition to their news value. But when you have a president who treats his words like an order of McDonald's fries, right, who just kind of puts them out there and doesn't seem to particularly care what weight or value they hold, or what impact they can make beyond like narrow political considerations. I do think it raises this weird and interesting question for journalists. To what degree should we hold those tweets, take those tweets seriously, but also just for everyone whose sort of machinations depend on knowing what the President of the United States thinks. If you are a foreign government, if you are a business owner, if you are any of these stakeholders in the domestic international system, I imagine it must be a bit bewildering to figure out how to navigate when you have a president who doesn't seem to value his own rhetoric.
And that's the confusion, especially overseas, because I think in the U.S., we have a way to figure out whether the stuff is real or not. You know, we can talk behind the scenes with White House officials and say, is this planned or was this just him speaking? You can talk to people on Capitol Hill and see if there's actually legislation that's, you know, maybe going to be pushed around something that he's talking about. You can get reaction from the FBI on, you know, what they think about being called out by the president, whether it has anything to do with Russia, you know. You don't have that same sort of safety net overseas.
Right. And I did not mean to slander McDonald's. McDonald's fries are delicious.
You're on thin ice. I want to read something, and not just because it's from my boss, but Marty Barron, the executive editor of the Post, gave a speech last week at Oxford. And among the things he said was this: we must recognize that something profound has changed in our profession. Journalism may not work as it did in the past. Our work's anticipated impact may not materialize. The public may not process information as it did previously. Jamelle, take that on. What works today in the kind of journalism we were all taught to practice, and what doesn't? I mean, to what extent have, has the laws of physics changed in the way we operate?
So I don't think the laws of physics have changed in how we operate. I mean, I'm thinking of one of the biggest stories in the United States over the past 6 months has been the Me Too movement, and to the extent that caught fire with like millions of Americans, it was in large part because of journalism, because of investigative, heavy-hitting, comprehensive journalism. I think part of the problem with regards to President Trump in terms of making an impact isn't so much that the public, that good journalism isn't, the public isn't responding to good journalism. I think it's, there's just a lot happening. There's a lot to focus on. And I think if you are an ordinary consumer of news, if you are an opponent of Trump, if you're not an opponent of Trump, there's so much happening. There's almost a paralysis of choice going on and a paralysis of attention. That is kind of the barrier to impact. But when there is a singular event to focus on and a singular drive to cover it, I do think that makes considerable impact. Yeah,
I don't know if this is all what Marty had in his mind when he said that, but I was really disheartened with the response to the Roy Moore coverage in that the Washington Post first began, and just the number of people saying that they didn't believe the story because it was in the Washington Post, and then the campaign afterwards to try and to try and discredit it. I mean, I thought that was really kind of an alarm. I don't know. I felt it was really, things became real. That you had a really well reported story that followed all the rules of journalism, and there was a group of people that just weren't going to believe it because of the venue that it was coming from, because of the source it was coming from, and the source being, one of the world's greatest newspapers, So I thought that really said, well, this is real. And I know that eventually, that Roy Moore lost, and I'm sure you can attribute it to that. I'm sure there's other factors too. He was an imperfect candidate on a lot of issues, but I thought, boy, that it's going to be hard to break the truth through sometimes. And this isn't your question you asked, maybe we'll ask it later, but I've been thinking a lot even before this Mueller indictment came out, and maybe it's because I've been doing a lot of Russia investigation stuff, but I feel that the Russia disinformation campaign is incredibly real and incredibly dangerous and a bigger threat than Trump. I mean, based on the people that I talk to in that world, in the intelligence community world, where we don't agree on the same facts, we don't agree on reality. And I think Trump was smart in his way, on his strategy to sort of hijack that. But I think the dynamics are changing. I think it is bigger than Trump, and I think it has a lot to do with this sort of fake news campaign.
The points that both of you make about the Me Too movement and about the Roy Moore coverage, I completely agree with that. And yet there is something unique about the president and the degree to which he has defied what we often have assumed are the metrics that affect a politician. Can both of you sort of take that piece of it on? What is it about Donald Trump? You know, Hallie, you went through that campaign. Domenico, you've been through a bunch of campaigns. As you look back on 2016, what did you take away from why we somehow didn't fully understand what was going on, or the degree to which he seemed immune and sustainably immune to things that took down other politicians in the past?
So I think there's a couple of things. To the first part of your question of when you look back, what did the media writ large do wrong? I think it's still something that we are still doing wrong, which is a lot of media people live in New York and DC and never leave. They just don't. And I think you lose a big connection with what people in the rest of the country feel. I had such a different experience on the campaign trail. I didn't go home for like a year. I mean, literally, I was on the road living in Iowa and here and everywhere else. I was telling Dan when I flew in, it was like...
Do you like this place better than
You're
Iowa?
not allowed to
I mean, clearly. But I was
This is on tape.
Yeah, exactly. I declined to comment, thank you. I love New Hampshire. And I was telling on the airport, and it was so familiar because we spend so much time here, and the Dunkin' Donuts we would always go to and all of this. So it's great to be back. I do think that being on the road, I had a very different perspective on the campaign than most people back at, whether it's in New York or DC or the news headquarters, whatever organization you were. Because you were literally out talking to people every day, not at campaign events. I had to eat, we'd go to breakfast. And people would talk to you, and you would talk to people with different perspectives and different views. Not because you were at a political event, but because you were just grabbing something at the CVS and talking with the clerk because you've been traveling and needed a razor, or whatever it is. You have interactions with people. That happens, I think, not enough in media, and I think that's a critical issue. We try to deal with it. I also have an MSNBC show. We do Outside the Beltway weeks regularly. We have to do them more, where we go and do the show from a different location and just to make the point of trying to get outside the bubble a little bit. I also think that the media has had to have a real gut check moment. Because what Donald Trump does is he takes a kernel of truth. He takes something that somebody did really get wrong. It was actually a mistake, and manages to exploit that in a way that paints with a very broad brush. So I think of, for example, a person that we all know in the White House press corps made a mistake very early on in the administration about the bust of Martin Luther King Jr. in the Oval Office. To this day, a mistake, by the way, that was corrected and apologized for. To this day, that is something that administration officials will still talk about as an example of all media being bad. And I think that is something that the president has gotten very good at. And then finally, and I promise to let you talk, he's also very authentic. When he doesn't like something, he speaks about it in a way and in language that I think resonates with a lot of people. He says that's crap, and people are like, yeah, that is crap. And he doesn't hide behind politician talk.
I think that the embers of cultural grievance have been sort of sitting like hot coals sort of beneath the surface of politics for a while. And he was able to exploit white grievance in particular. I mean, if you look at all the polling afterward, the issue polling about the things that are able, the Public Religion Research Institute did this poll about how to identify support for Trump versus doing cross sections of cultural grievance types questions. Immigration, is it bad or good for the country? Welfare recipients, lazy, not lazy. Those kinds of questions, right? Those things weighed out far more heavily than economic concerns for being a predictor of who Trump supporters were. Something like 52% of non-college whites or some college whites said that they thought that discrimination against whites was as bad a problem, if not worse, than discrimination against non-whites. So when you see things like that, you know, that tells you a little something. And I think that there's been so much frustration with Washington, with the establishment, the way things have been done, from this group of people who feel like they haven't been heard, right? And you have this guy come along talking about, it's okay to talk about your grievances, even if you're going to say it's economic. And it's okay to talk about these things that, you know, East Coast elitists with shiny degrees, you know, say that, you know, your opinion doesn't matter. And he goes out there and says, I'm going to talk for the forgotten man and woman. And when we go interview people and we're like, oh, that must be the thing that they're going to say, oh, you know, he's done. You know, there's a deep reservoir of support for him among that group of people because he went to Washington to do what they wanted, which was essentially give a giant middle finger to Washington and what it stands for. And you know, the fact that he's not getting anything done, quote unquote, and you know, of course he's not, is what they'll tell us. You know, that it's a deeply entrenched swamp, and you're not just going to get everything done. So, but he's going in there and he's making you all look bad. And we hear that over and over again. And you know, during the campaign, I'm proud of the coverage we had. We were out there, we were on the campaign trail. You know, David Broder, the late columnist at the Post, used to say, "Believe your eyes." And the problem was that we saw what was happening, but the data was telling us something else. And you know, the data is more scientifically accurate than your eyes because the anecdotes are not, you know, talk to a few people, it's sort of, it doesn't extrapolate out. So we were trying to balance, well, we see these, you know, these signs all over the place, but okay, the polling's telling you this, well, we balance these two things and let's see where it weighs out. And I think that in the campaigns going forward, believe your eyes is probably going to mean more than it did in the last cycle.
Jamelle, you were nodding on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time at big Trump rallies in various parts of the country, and I had a similar experience of witnessing sort of like this fervor that at times was genuinely concerning. Especially when he was going on one of his tangents involving brown-skinned people. I was sort of like, I don't know if I should be here anymore. But also the data clearly showed that this stuff was alienating. And so I think what happened for myself and I think a lot of journalists is that there's, you know, conventional wisdom about how open appeals to prejudice are politically poisonous, that they alienate more people than they bring into your campaign, and that just wasn't true. And that I think was that was the conventional wisdom that was overturned. And I myself I did not believe that was going to be the case. And I think that's the adjustment journalists have to make going forward in terms of trying to think about Trump's appeal and his appeal to the broader public. It turns out that you can make open appeals to resentment and prejudice. And as long as you do so with a sort of stable partisan identity, with the support of the bulk of a political party, it can end up a wash for most voters. I will add that I will dispute the premise of your question a little bit. I think political gravity does apply to Donald Trump. I mean, I do not think, I think there's a habit of talking about Donald Trump as if he's popular. As if he has some sort of unprecedented support, but he's been tremendously unpopular throughout his entire presence in politics. He is very unpopular right now, historically compared to other presidents. We mentioned a few minutes ago that Roy Moore, a Republican in Alabama, lost a Senate seat in Alabama. I highly doubt that if Donald Trump were not in office, if Donald Trump were not in office, I highly doubt that Roy Moore would have lost that seat. I think he is unpopular enough with enough voters that Republicans are obviously worrying about being able to hold Congress. And we're seeing the limits of this approach once in office. And I think that's the critical thing. I think once in office, the kind of politics that Donald Trump did on the stump just wear very differently.
But do you think that culture has replaced economics or made it a co-equal in the way our politics is now shaped? I mean, I think all of us I know myself, I won't speak for anybody else, but sort of covered politics for a long enough time that we thought that economics was the basic frame for the way voters thought about their own well-being. Now, obviously, there are lots of other issues depending on what's happening in the world. But it seemed as though we came out of 2016 understanding the power of the cultural divisions in the country, which in some places superseded economic. How do you, you've got a sharp eye on these things. What do you think?
I tend to think that there are obviously different kinds of cultural sort of issues and things that activate voters. And so, for white evangelical voters, it's very clear that abortion is sort of the primary issue driving their voting behavior, regardless of their kind of economic standing. But one thing that I think that the data bears out post-election, but also that the history bears out, is that there are large numbers of voters for whom their cultural identity with regards to race or gender is tied up in how they think about their economic prospects, right? And so it's not that there's economic anxiety or racial resentment or racial anxiety. It's that racial anxiety can produce economic anxiety, and economic anxiety, worries about your material status, can produce worries about your racial status as well. I think that's what Trump ultimately, inadvertently perhaps, weaponized, noting that it wasn't just immigration; it was immigration in the context of jobs. It wasn't just China abstractly; it was China in the context of sort of American industry, and that that's a potent combination. It's such a potent combination that it really did form the basis of Democratic Party appeals in the early 20th century, right? In the South, that was the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the South. Its appeal was basically, we will deliver you benefits and we won't give them to black people. That was what they built their dominance on. And with the emergence of a civil rights consensus that civil equality and equality under the law is something we want to extend to all Americans, that sort of fell out of favor, and I think Trump basically rediscovered it and deployed it to great use. Now the question is that implies that it really does matter to deliver. You do have to actually deliver something, and for President Trump, it'll remain to be seen whether in 2020 the voters in Ohio, in Wisconsin, and Michigan who decided to vote their cultural resentments and their economic anxieties and the interplay between them, whether they will feel that President Trump has actually delivered on the material part of that bargain. I
want to shift the discussion now to the topic of fake news. We've certainly never had a president in modern times who deals with the truth quite in the way that President Trump does. To put it mildly, the litany is quite well known. But the question that I wanted to ask all of you, because you each work for different kinds of institutions, the press obviously has a responsibility to call out falsehoods. But what are the boundaries? What are the ground rules, and how do you grapple with that? And how has that changed over the arc of the time from when Donald Trump first became a candidate to the way he and those kinds of things are treated today? Hallie, start with you on that.
So, as sort of the cable news representative here up on the stage, I do think that there was a period in time in the very early stages of the candidacy for Donald Trump that his rallies would just go out unfiltered, without being fact-checked in real time, without being fact-checked on banners. I think before it became clear what he was before a lot of things became clear, let's say. I do think that very quickly, I know that our organization picked up on the idea that he can't just, you got to be fact-checking people in real time, all candidates, when they are delivering speeches that are going out broadcast on your air. That's been something that's been critical ever since really 2015, and it continues up until this day. When you talk about fact checks, when you talk about the phrase fake news, it's interesting. Fake news has kind of become this thing that I think journalists kind of say to each other as a funny joke, aha, what are you, fake news? It's not funny. I don't think it's that funny, because I do think it is a dangerous term. And I think that people oftentimes, because they hear it so much, wrap anything they don't like or anything that they might have questions about into this umbrella of fake news. There is real Russian fake news and misinformation and disinformation that is out there that is actual fake news. What Donald Trump sometimes calls fake news is not. Frequently is not. And so I don't love the phrase. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's a funny joke. I think it's bad. It's a bad thing. As far as how we cover it, our challenge is, for example, in the broadcast, so I also obviously file for Nightly News and the Today Show, we fact check everything live as it happens in our pieces, because that's the critical piece. If you're going to say some sort of claim from the president, you also have to, as Domenico's talked about, put it into context, because people don't follow this stuff. You guys are all here at a political forum on a Tuesday night, which is great. I would say that a lot of people wouldn't do that, you know, and I think that a lot of people aren't following it quite as closely. So, for example, I will give you an example today. I did a piece for the show on this morning, the Today Show. The tweet the president sent about President Obama did nothing on Russian sanctions, or something along those lines. So we talked about how the president's clearly stewing about Russia. He tweeted 18 times in 5 days about the Russia investigation. This is something that he said. And here's what President Obama at the time actually did, 1, 2, and 3. And here's what a top Democrat is saying, et cetera. So you have to fold that into the context of your pieces. And I think for us, it's critical to do that, even if you only have 1 minute and 45 seconds to tell a story, which we do on the broadcast news. You have to put that in there. It's just non-negotiable. And I think that helps.
I think Shannon made a really interesting point earlier about the Roy Moore race and the fact that despite the people named in the story, never mind that people didn't believe it, that it just had zero credibility because of the outlet it came from, which should have given it more credibility in the first place. I think that is, you know, there used to be rules, right? I mean, there used to be, as a consumer, you might not believe a piece that just had a bunch of blind quotes in it, right? Because nobody's name is attached to this thing. You know, what do I know if this is real or not? That stuff goes on like page 6 of the New York Post, right? Like, blind item, what's happening, such and such is pregnant, like whatever, right? And, you know, and this, the Roy Moore thing, and frankly Trump during the election, women came forward with their names attached to their story. And not one woman, not 2 women, dozens, right? I mean, if you combine the two. You know, there's supposed to be a level of credibility that goes to someone's name and story and face being a part of it, rather than it just being fake, you know, because it came from the Washington Post. I mean, that is a slippery slope, you know, problem in this country that I think Marty's exactly right about. That, you know, I think one side of the spectrum has I think, wants more of the fact checking, and another side just wants to dismiss it. And it's a very difficult thing to break through. You know, I mean, I can tout the fact that NPR came up with a great fact-checking annotation tool during the campaign. You know, 2 of the fact checks we did, and one of the for the debate, and then with his 100 days promises, we annotated those. And Chartbeat, which measures these things, said that they were the two of the biggest stories they had seen all year, which for NPR is like, you know, if we had a nickel, like, please, you know, like, and but it's sort of like, yay, good, but at the same time, it's like, we can't agree on a set of facts, then that's a real problem. Because if people are looking at that, and we try painstakingly, and I think the real issue is that, like, you have to hunker down and think, okay, I am going to do my best to make sure that this is incontrovertible. You know, that the study I cite, that the facts that I use for this are incontrovertible, and I do it with sobriety and without like a taint of, you know, of bias, snark. Right. You know, we have a podcast and we try to.
Is that because the stakes are higher right now?
I think so, because, you know, you're going to get called out almost immediately, even if something is slightly, you know.
Like Hallie talked about the Martin Luther King bus.
Yeah, right. I mean,
a small thing,
which was an innocent mistake,
yes.
and was corrected.
There can always be a debate among people about data, like, well, why did you use this unemployment number rather than this metric? You know, so even when you know, there can always be a debate, but at least that's in like the same realm, a similar realm of
trying to get to the same
facts. We're sort of talking in the same realm, but then some of these fact check issues. We're not even agreeing on, you know, like using information from the CDC or the NIH. Well, there's, you know, people who don't trust the CDC or the NIH or the FDA, so don't trust the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I think that's kind of like a smaller
I do think that's an outlier. The president
right,
himself
and an outlier,
cites
but-
economic numbers when a year and a half ago he said that those numbers were not right. I do think that Domenico hit on something when you talk about sobriety and the tone. I think that's critically important, I think, for most platforms, unless you're an opinion columnist or an opinion show.
But are you all more sensitive to that today than you were 2 years ago?
I mean, I feel like it. I feel like we are at a moment where we have to do our jobs flawlessly. And I mean, maybe that's a good thing that's come out of all this, is because, I feel like I have to do a better job, that that we have to find 17 sources to verify something that that I feel like I have to do my job the best I've ever done it, because I do feel like we are on a pen, on the tip of a knife here, and that the public, our audience, could so easily tip to the other way, where they just lose credibility in us. I do think we are at a really crucial moment. And I do think we all, as journalists, and could do better, and that each one of us could be doing better. And I mean, I think there have been moments over the past year, our reporting, other people's reporting, where we've said things were going to happen that didn't happen. Oh, this person's going to get fired, they're still here, where we have not question the motives of the people telling us the information enough. When, so this eager and this hunger to get stories out there and to be first, and to, and to sort of, make a name for yourself, we haven't questioned hard enough why people are telling things. Where did they get that information from? How did they get it? Prove it to us, show us an email. I think in this year, we've kind of, we have moved a bit too fast on things, and it's been kind of, Bloomberg's kind of interesting organization, because we do have a website and a mass audience, but we also have a group of paid subscribers, usually in the banking, finance, government world. I don't know what it is, 300,000 paid subscribers now who pay $20,000 a year for all of our news and data and information. And they pay that much money because they trust that when they get data or information from us, they can take it to the bank, literally. That if we report Gary Cohn is leaving, and that indicates to them that tax reform is going to fall apart, they might make a $2 billion bet on something based on that information. So we have always held ourselves to an incredibly high standard. And it has personally frustrated me to see stories slip out of our hands and feel like, are we being too cautious? Are we being too easy on things? But knowing that for the average consumer, if someone tells you, oh, Gary Cohn's on the rocks, you're going to be like, whatever, oh, well, good, one less globalist in the White House or whatever. That's not going to be actionable information to you. But I feel like it has been good for me personally to have this other standard of, listen, there's someone's placing a bet on this information. It better really be right, or they're going to call Mike Bloomberg, and Mike Bloomberg's going to call your boss and say, what the fuck was that? I don't know if that's happening, but I can clearly imagine it really easily.
Just one other point on this. Everything Shannon's talking about, I feel on a daily basis too. But the rigor and all that we put into it, the self-reflection that we think about, like the lowest hanging fruit stuff we can't agree on. Not us, but like society. Like I'll give you just a short example, right? Most politicians are shameable. And what I mean by that is, and this is not a Republican or Democrat thing, Chris Christie kept saying that he was appointed by George W. Bush on 9/11. Remember this? And then he did it a couple times, and we went back and said, oh, that's an interesting fact. I'd never heard that before. You would think we would know that. So we checked, and he wasn't. He was appointed like 2 weeks before or something, right? So we pointed that out to him in his campaign. And you know what Chris Christie did? He stopped saying it. He went to saying, I was appointed around 9/11 or whatever it was that was more accurate, right? And like, good, that's what should happen, right? But then if you were to say that to Donald Trump, like, you weren't appointed on 9/11, it's like, yeah, basically I was, I mean, it just, okay, You know, I mean, what do you do to that? There's no amount of rigor that we can institute to change that.
But if I could just make, I was about to say, which is that we're all operating in good faith. We really do want to inform the public. We really do want to do the best job that we can. When we make mistakes, they are mistakes. They aren't sort of nefarious plans to get one over on the general public. Some of our critics are likewise acting in good faith, want to get the best information out. But I think a lot of our critics are not operating in good faith. They're operating in patently bad faith. And I don't think journalism as an institution is figuring out what to do about bad faith critics, right? Do you ignore them? Do you disregard them? What if the bad faith critic is the President of the United States? What if the bad faith critic is the press secretary, the White House press secretary? What do you do when you have critics who aren't actually interested in the same end goal as you, and who in fact see your goal as being the best neutral arbiter of truth? In fact, you can be as harmful to their political standing, that they don't want neutral arbiters. They don't want independent experts. I think part of the current sort of attack on the FBI from not just members of the administration, but members with the people within the Republican Party and the larger conservative movement is precisely about delegitimizing the idea of this neutral arbiter. And I don't have an answer for what you do about that, but I do think that sort of good intentions among journalists sort of we continue doing our best, but that's less of a, you know, how can we improve ourselves, and more how do we do with individuals, institutions that have set themselves up as actual like enemies of the press. And
what is the answer to that in this environment?
Well, I mean, I can only control myself. You know, I can't stop what Kellyanne's going to say about our reporting, what the president's going to say about our reporting. You know, I can only control myself, and you know, and you guys can only do, you know, the best. You know, you guys can only put 4 bylines on a story with 6 sources saying this happened, and you know, so I think we can only do what we can do. We can only do the best job we can do every day.
I think part of it is I listen to the conversation, you know, we're fortunate enough to be here at this beautiful school, at this college, but I think there's a lot of people in this country. Marty alluded to this at his speech, Dan, which I think was such a well-written piece. He said 2 things that struck me. One, he talked about the idea that knowledge, and I don't know the exact quote, but it was something like, educating yourself around the facts in the news is like an elitist pastime, or is perceived and is pushed as this elitist thing that people do. And people immediately, I think there's a lot of folks in this country who resist that elitism because that's not what they're about. And so they would hear something like, Domenico, your story, and I can hear it in my head. I think we know people like this, we all do, who would say, why are you nitpicking? Okay, it was around 9/11, whatever, like get off his back. I think is the attitude that some people would have on something like that. Because it goes to the second thing that Marty pointed out, which is a litany, when he started that speech at Oxford, of the polling and the information that has come out about how distrusted the news media is by vast swaths of people in this country. Depressingly huge numbers for somebody who has made this their life's work and their career and truly believes in it and is passionate about it. And so I do think that those are the people, and it's not just, as Jamelle talks about, the bad faith critics, because there's obviously those things happen and there's think pieces and all these, but it's just it's people at home who just don't trust you. And I think you have to change that, and part of it is by being really transparent.
Before you hang on 1 second.
Yeah.
We're going to turn to questions from you all any minute now. So there are going to be microphones which will be moved up a little bit in the far aisles. So if you have questions, start to line up and we'll get to you in a couple minutes.
So the thing that I was going to say is that I think this brings us to the next level of what journalists aren't used to doing. And that's explaining to the general public why some of this stuff is important. You know, what is normally known as the nut graph in a story, we have to pound that nut graph.
Explain what that
term
means.
A nut graph in a story usually tells you the so what. As the former English teacher, I taught high school English, and I would say to 14-year-olds when they would write stuff and it would just go on and on and on, I'd say, so what? Like, you got to tell me, why do I care about this, right? And we have to do that. We have to reorient ourselves to saying, so what? Like, early on when Reince Priebus, the former chief of staff, said that, you know, maybe we'll do away with the press briefing. you know, or something like it. And you know what people at home said? Who cares? Because like you're a bunch of
Whatever, he has Twitter, it's fine.
right? And like I don't need you guys asking questions just to make yourselves look good. Like you know, why does it matter? And then you have to sort of step back and say, you know, you have to explain why this matters. We went over it. I remember when we were writing this story, I said, no, we have to put up high, like, why this matters. And I think it's the same thing with, like, why are you nitpicking, right? Why are you nitpicking that Chris Christie is saying it was on 9/11 and it wasn't? Is it because it's intentional from Chris Christie to paint himself to wrap himself in 9/11, you know, to show that he's a metropolitan area governor and wants to build himself to a different level than necessarily he is, and to hold him accountable for that. And you know, I think it's uncomfortable for us because we're constantly chasing facts and wanting to, you know, confirm stories, but we need to do more of that.
Just a quick note, which I think relates to something that we were speaking about a little earlier, which is that I think there's another dynamic at work here with regards to the press and the public and trust, and that is, you know, so much of how voters act is through partisan cues from their political leaders. And one thing I do think is happening right now is that the drive to delegitimize the news media from President Trump, from a variety of different sort of hard right outlets, is that distrusting the press is beginning to fall under the mantle of what it means to be a member of the Republican Party, right? That we're Republicans, we don't trust the press. And to fix that, I don't think that's necessarily on us to fix that. I think that's on Republican Party elites to sort of begin to assert commitments to, you know, at least the abstract idea of truth and press freedom and so on and so forth.
And that was definitely obviously a pre-Trump phenomenon too. Yeah, that I think a lot of things he catches on, you know, he's able to catch on to something under the current, and I don't know what the analogy is or something, but you know, and bring it up. Yeah.
To Hallie's point about the distrust and some of the things that Marty Barron was talking about, there's a recent survey that Gallup and the Knight Foundation did, and Jamelle, your point is absolutely right. On most of these kinds of questions, there's a clear partisan difference, and Republicans are much more skeptical of the press in general than are Democrats. But 66% in this survey say the media do not do a good job separating fact from fiction. 66%, this is of all people, not just, you know, Republicans. 66% say news organizations are sometimes too dramatic or too sensational. 65% say there is too much bias in the reporting of stories, and 64% say there is too much bias in the selection of what stories news organizations cover and don't cover. And I think that's a basic difference in the way people see the role of the media and what people are selecting. Hallie gets the last word. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, and I want to particularly thank the 4 journalists here on